At the end of today's service, I'm going to give each of you a homework assignment. Now, I don't want to make the same mistake that another minister made after giving his congregation a homework assignment. The minister said he would not preach again until 50% of the congregation had completed the task before them. Rumor has it he still has not preached. His intentions were admirable. His sense of job security was lacking. In the last 20 years, end-of-life care has changed dramatically. We have many more options available to us, and while we may not have every choice we might want, we need to take full advantage of the choices we do have. It's been said that Unitarian Universalists will talk about virtually anything in our Sunday services, with the possible exception of money. Just so you know, we're going to correct that in 2 weeks. I believe our willingness to address unpopular and even uncomfortable topics is a strength of our faith. We don't have answers easily laid out for us, certainly not around issues like death. And we are willing in our Sunday services to tackle the meaning of life and the mystery of death. And yet, if we do talk about death and dying, we are more likely to do it in a group like this. What we fail to do still is have these important conversations with people who most need to know what we want with regard to end-of-life care. We need to talk to our families and our doctors. Why might we be afraid or reluctant to talk about our own deaths? Do we fear death? If I were candid, I would admit that I don't want to die, but I don't think I fear death. I've heard it said that most do not fear death, that what we fear is dying. Do we fear the high cost of end-of-life care? Do we fear becoming a burden to our families? Do we fear a painful death? Do we fear loss of control and dignity? I believe that talking about our deaths to our families is a way of addressing our own fears. And we can have a direct impact on each of these concerns I just mentioned by talking to our families, by letting our desires be known. The high cost, becoming a burden, a painful death, having some control and dignity at the end. These can be alleviated if we're willing to talk to our families and our doctors. Perhaps more importantly, it is a disservice to ourselves and our families to remain quiet. Bill Moyers says, "It is a tragedy for the one who dies, because even when surrounded by family and friends, when no one talks of death, the person dies alone." In preparing for this sermon, I confirmed that death is a topic that our listening circles talk about from time to time. And listening circles are a safe place to talk about death and even to practice those conversations that we need to have with our families. If you don't know, our listening circles are facilitated small groups here at Emerson, where a topic is presented and participants are invited to go more deeply than they would in casual conversation. Our listening circles are spiritual, deepening groups. And if you want to learn more, there will be a table staffed in the fellowship hall after the service today. In the 21st century, we have the opportunity to express our wishes with regard to end-of-life care. We can specify in advance what steps are to be taken or not taken when we are seriously ill. In our technologically sophisticated society, the measures to keep someone alive are innumerable. And too often, healthcare professionals don't have the benefit of knowing what we desire. If we want to have some input into the process, we must speak up. This can be accomplished by a document called 5 Wishes, which will be handed out at the end of the service today. 5 Wishes allows one to designate who will make medical decisions if you cannot. And you can choose explicitly the level of treatment you wish to receive, and under what conditions. As I learned in my own training for ministry, this is not a document you put in the safety deposit box. You put it in an easily accessible place, and you let your family know it's there. While this document is important, the most critical thing any of us can do is to talk with our family members and doctors about our wishes. That's the third time I've said that, I know. Too often, important documents can't be located, and doctors will look to family members for help in making healthcare decisions when the patient is unable to do so. A number of years ago, my mother entered a nursing home, having lost her capacity for both long-term and short-term memory. 5 years later, when she began a sharp decline, a sharp physical decline, it became impossible to feed her either by mouth or intravenously. I don't know if it was the right decision, but hoping she could bounce back, my sisters and I gave permission for a feeding tube to be inserted. When my mother went into shock at receiving that treatment, the nurse stepped out into the hall where we were waiting and told us that we had a decision to make immediately. They could treat our mother with extraordinary measures, or they could not, and our mother would die within 5 minutes. Luckily, our mother had made it very clear to each of us what her wishes were, and we as a family decided not to use extraordinary measures. The nurse understood and told us that in 5 minutes our mother would be dead. I will forever cherish those 5 minutes that I shared with my mother while she was dying. I offer one postscript to this personal story. After my mother died, I called Carol, who was my fiancée at the time, and I called my minister. Both asked if they could come and be with me. I said no to both, that I was fine, and I did get through it. But I wish I had said yes to one or both, to come be with me, to be with me in my grief, and I encourage you to allow others to be with you in your times of grieving. With the reformulation of end-of-life care, we now have some say about when and where and how we will die. In the last half of the 20th century, most of us would have expected to die in a hospital or a nursing home. But today, when given a terminal diagnosis, many people express a strong desire to die at home. One of the most important changes in the last few years is the increased availability of hospice care. A friend once told me the following story. A couple she had known lived a full life, and part of that life was the couple's shared love of dancing. When the woman was diagnosed with a terminal illness, she desperately wanted to die at home. As she lost weight and as her body weakened, it became increasingly difficult for her to walk to the bathroom without assistance. In an act of seeming playfulness, the couple developed a routine where she would literally stand on his feet and he would walk her to the bathroom. With their bodies pressed together, with their arms holding on to each other, and with her feet following his, these daily trips became their final dance. Maintaining this close relationship would have been difficult if she had not been able to receive treatment at home. But with hospice nurses visiting a couple of times a week, the couple was able to maintain a modicum of intimacy at the end of her life. Not everyone can be cared for at home. Today, hospice facilities provide warm, almost homey rooms without constant medical interruption. They have liberal visitation policies, and staff have been trained to understand the role they play in end-of-life care. An important part of end-of-life care is what is called palliative care. It's an approach to end of life based on the premise that comfort is possible even when a cure is not. Palliative care is more comprehensive than simple pain management. It provides patients with relief from symptoms, pain, physical stress, and mental stress of a serious illness, whatever the diagnosis. The goal is to improve quality of life for both the patient and family. All of the choices I've mentioned allow us to define the care we will receive as we approach death. There are times, however, when we might wish to have more control over the timing of our own deaths. There are those circumstances when the quality of one's own life is so diminished that someone may want assistance to end his or her life before nature intervenes. As one example, consider Jim's story. Jim was suffering from ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. In the course of this disease, the mind remains clear, while the body becomes increasingly paralyzed until even the ability to breathe is slowly lost. Jim was a veterinarian, and he had both the knowledge and the means to take his own life. He had a dilemma, though. As his body slowly shut down, he knew he would reach the point where he would want to take his own life. But when he reached that point, he would no longer be physically able to do it. He was therefore faced with the choice of having to take his own life before he wanted to. In Oregon, they passed the Death with Dignity Act in 1994. It makes physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide legal. There are strict requirements governing its use. A person must have a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less. 2 doctors must agree, and a patient must be mentally capable of understanding his or her situation. I find Jim's circumstances quite compelling for physician-assisted death, and yet the options available in Oregon are not available everywhere. In 2008, the state of Washington became the second state to pass a Death with Dignity Act, and in 2013, the state of Vermont passed similar legislation. As I reflected on assisted dying, I wondered if there were other types of diseases that should be covered. What about those who suffer from the ravages of dementia? Dementia fails Oregon's Death with Dignity Act on 2 counts. Dementia is not a terminal illness. In fact, a person can and will often languish for years. And a patient with dementia would fail the competency test. I recognize the difficulty of including dementia under the umbrella of physician-assisted suicide. Who would make the decision and when? I'm not suggesting there are easy answers. The choices provided to us at the end of life, while not perfect, are as great as they have ever been. But to take full advantage of these options, it requires our participation. What we are called to do can be as simple as making our wishes known to our families and physicians. That's the 4th time I've said that. But we may also choose to do work as advocates so that Oregon's Death with Dignity Act is available nationwide. I would be in favor of that. In preparing for this sermon, I found a synonym for death with dignity. It is called a good death. I spoke with 2 members of Emerson about their recent experiences with family members who had died. A common theme from these 2 conversations was the value of communicating one's wishes to those closest to you. If you don't communicate your wishes, one told me, your wishes cannot be respected. The members I spoke with told me that their family members asked to die at home, surrounded by loved ones. And that is exactly what happened. What made these stories have happy endings and a good death or a death with dignity is what I call a happy ending, is that family members were willing to talk about death. I'd like to share a third story about death with dignity. For the previous 2 weeks, we have talked about homelessness. And at first thought, it may seem that the homeless could never have a dignified death. But this past week, I learned just the opposite. An Emerson member had a brother who was homeless for 25 years due to alcoholism. This past week, just this past week, the timing is crazy. This past week, this Emerson member learned of a caring professional in California, very much like the Reverend Beck Cranford Smith, who spoke here 2 weeks ago. This caring professional in California had befriended the brother of the Emerson member and was with him when he died. And the professional in California reached out and found the Emerson member, the family, and shared these stories. The details are extraordinary and reflect the human capacity for easing the suffering of others. As Unitarian Universalists, let us not be fearful of death or dying, but speak about our own inevitable deaths and what end-of-life care we wish to receive. In doing so, we eliminate death's stigma, and we serve as an example to our families who desperately need our examples. But I believe we also have a larger role to play. While palliative care has its place, I invite you to become an advocate so that we each might have greater say in the timing of our own deaths. And as done in Oregon, Washington, and in Vermont, we might have death with dignity in Georgia as well. I can imagine no more personal right, no more humane right than a death with dignity act. May we each seek quality of life and also seek quality of death. May it be so.